In the winter of 1942, the city of Stalingrad was a place of ruined factories, bottled up warehouses, and streets that each became a front. Stories of Vasily Zaitsev and other Soviet snipers are well known. Their presence was as much psychological as tactical. A sniper in an urban fight does three things. He removes enemies, he forces attention, and he sows uncertainty. Commanders who once moved their heads above a parapet suddenly considered whether an unseen pair of eyes could be trained on them. There is a pattern repeated through the war. In intense urban combat, a few skilled marksmen, often working as teams with a spotter, could pin defenders' heads down, force the diversion of soldiers to guard officers and engineers, and slow an attacker's timetable by days rather than hours. That delay matters. A delayed assault gives time for reinforcements to arrive, for artillery to be adjusted, for supply lines to be rerouted. It is not the single bullet that wins a battle. It is the ripple effect of fear, caution, and slowed momentum. Consider a representative vignette from the winter fighting on the Eastern Front. A small group of house-to-house defenders held a factory complex against superior numbers. The defenders knew every stairwell, every echo. Among them was a young man who had spent his youth hunting in the forests. His steady hand and patience were worth more than a platoon. By picking off men who attempted to reconnoiter, by forcing attackers to divert engineers to clear windows and doorways, he stretched the attacker's timetable. Those extra hours allowed the defenders' artillery to bring up a battery and delivered ammunition by a night convoy. The larger battle shifted. The assault failed where it had hoped to succeed. Historians can point to artillery ranges and resupply schedules. Veterans remember the man behind the cracked factory window. Similar accounts emerged from the Normandy hedgerows in 1944. The bocage country, the thick, high hedgerows, was a terrain that negated some of the Allies' advantages. It also amplified one-on-one encounters. A sniper or a well-placed anti-tank rifle team in a hedgerow could stop a platoon, or at least force it to move with extreme caution. Those delays frustrated commanders who counted on momentum and on coordinated paces. In some cases, small teams of defenders turned the hedgerows into a series of defensive microbastions, each adding hours to the enemy's timetable and enabling reinforcements or evacuation. Across the Pacific, on islands where visibility ranged from open coral flats to dense jungle, snipers and well-trained marksmen served both as sentries and as psychological weapons. An unseen adversary did not need many strikes to compel a change in tactics, more guards, slower patrols, and the loss of surprise. In those circumstances, a single capable marksman could buy a unit the breathing space to withdraw, to reorganize, or to call in a heavier response. It is important to recognize that sniper tricks in these stories are not offered as instructions. What mattered most historically were broader principles: patience, camouflage in the broad sense, knowledge of terrain, the use of spotters and coordinated observation, and the way a few accurate, well-timed shots could alter the decisions of commanders at every level. These principles are what the armies realized and exploited, not a secret manual of how to be lethal. Part 2. Improvisation, adaptation, and what soldiers called field bright ideas. War is 1,000 small repairs. When a gearbox fails or a radio goes quiet, a soldier's willingness to improvise keeps the machine of war moving. Some of the tricks that found their way into the historical record were simple: jury-rigging a bracket with a file and a strip of metal, patching a leaking tank radiator with a soldered patch, or using a different lubricant under cold conditions. These are not glamorous. They are the work of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. One famous theme is the use of captured equipment. All armies salvaged and reused what they could from the enemy, from rifles to vehicles to maps. Captured weapons sometimes filled shortages at a critical moment. They also occasionally provided material surprises. For example, in the North African campaign, crews who became familiar with captured Italian or German equipment learned its quirks and sometimes employed it in ambush or deception. That sort of tactical opportunism is not the stuff of glossy histories, but it shows up in memoirs again and again. The young mechanic who keeps a column moving because he can splice two different kinds of wiring, the ordnance sergeant who swaps a damaged sight from a fallen enemy weapon into his platoon's inventory because it fits, and the artillery battery that borrows an enemy fuse type to make practice possible when supplies have run out. Another recurring wartime theme was simple ingenuity in the face of a design flaw. All weapons and vehicles are compromises, armor at the cost of speed, firepower at the cost of reliability. Crews learned to use those trade-offs to their advantage. When a tank's radio had limited range, crews established runners and visual signals. When a rifle tended to jam in mud, men learned particular maintenance rituals to keep it moving. In the aggregate, these small innovations maintained effectiveness. There are well-known engineer stories too. Allied sappers adapted bridges to carry heavier loads than originally specified by reinforcing with scavenged steel. German repair teams in the East improvised to keep panzers operational past where they should have failed. These acts of maintenance and make-do mattered strategically because a frontline army needs operational equipment. An arm that arrived late or not at all could change the outcome of an engagement. Again, to be clear, I do not describe specific modifications that would teach someone how to alter a weapon. The historical significance is that armies adapted through field repairs, resourcefulness, and an intimate knowledge of their materiel. And those adaptations often made the difference between withdrawal and holding, between loss and survival. Part 3. Iron and steel tanks as design, doctrine, and drama. If you are a certain age, you remember the feel of newsreels and the grain of film showing tanks their soot-streaked faces, the creak of their turrets. Tanks are machines that embody trade-offs: speed versus armor, crew survivability versus ease of maintenance, gun size versus turret balance. The story of how tanks changed the war is as much about these engineering compromises as it is about tactics. A few interesting facts about prominent designs. The Soviet T-34 is often celebrated for its sloped armor and relatively wide tracks. The slope increased effective armor thickness against incoming shells, and the wide tracks helped mobility in mud and snow. Those features made it a difficult opponent across the Eastern Front and contributed to its reputation as one of the most influential designs of the war. The American M4 Sherman was not the heaviest or most armored tank, but it was reliable and produced in large numbers. Its commonality of parts and relative ease of maintenance meant that it could be kept on the road under demanding conditions. When the Allies needed numbers and sustained operations across broad fronts, that reliability mattered. Later British versions, the Firefly, for example, were fitted with more powerful guns to engage heavier German tanks with better effect. German heavy tanks, such as the Tiger, carried very powerful guns and heavy armor. They were formidable in a duel, but they were also complex machines that demanded care, fuel, and spare parts. Their impressive performance on the battlefield was sometimes offset by logistical strain and mechanical fragility in the long campaigns on the Eastern Front and in Normandy. British designs like the Churchill emphasized heavy armor and crossing ability. Some designs favored particular battlefield roles such as infantry support or specialized combat engineering. In key moments, small adjustments to tank employment had oversized consequences. At Kursk in 1943, the mass use of Soviet tanks in defensive and counterattacking formations combined with an industrial advantage in production helped blunt and eventually reverse a major German offensive. At El Alamein, the British combined mobility, armor, and coordinated artillery to push back Rommel's forces and open the road toward Tunisia. In Normandy, the Allies' ability to combine infantry, armor, and air support was decisive. But again, small things mattered. The arrival of specialized variants, dozers, bridge layers, mine-clearing tanks helped get a column moving that otherwise might have stalled. One representative anecdote that appears across multiple unit histories involves Shermans and Fireflies facing Tigers in hedgerow country. A small British armored column, advancing through bocage and hampered by poor lines of sight, encountered a German heavy tank that dominated a narrow lane. The senior tank commander ordered his men to use the hedgerows and broken ground to approach within an effective range for the Firefly's gun. The Firefly, positioned by a bold NCO, disabled the enemy's commanding tank. The chance to exploit that success came because the Allied crew had practiced rapid turret turns, coordinated loader assistance, and a clear doctrine to get close, strike, and withdraw. Whether that one encounter changed the day or the week depends on your level of analysis, but there is no question that such encounters, small, fierce, and resolved by a handful of men with complicated machines, add up. These are the moments when design meets doctrine and when crew cohesion turns steel into a decisive instrument. The machine without the crew is inert. The crew without spare parts is vulnerable. The doctrine without the machine is theory. Those intersections created the battlefield outcomes that historians study. Part 4. Deception and the quiet arts of survival. The war was also a contest of deception, camouflage, misdirection, and the repurposing of captured signals were arts of their own. In Britain, Operation Fortitude, part of the greater deception apparatus around the Normandy invasion, used fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, and carefully managed leaks to convince German commanders that the landing would occur elsewhere. The broader lesson is that not all battlefield victories are achieved by direct force. Some are achieved by convincing the enemy not to be where you plan to strike. On the small unit level, similar forms of deception had outsized effects. Fake positions, dummy equipment, and controlled fires could direct enemy artillery away from the real concentrations. In one anecdote from the Mediterranean theater, a battery placed a few smoldering bivouacs and a false vehicle park to lure enemy reconnaissance and adjust attention. The battery itself remained quiet and effective elsewhere. These were simple measures, often improvised from scrap, but they were effective because they manipulated an opponent's perception and attention. Part V. The moral arithmetic and the weight of one life. If you have known someone who was there, you will know that war is not an arithmetical exercise. It is a ledger of human decisions. Snipers and tank crews alike learned that a well-timed shot or a repaired gearbox could spare lives on their side and end lives on the other. Veterans' letters, diaries, and memoirs dwell often on restraint as much as on effectiveness. There are accounts of sharpshooters who refused particular targets because of personal reasons. There are tank crews who paused to take on wounded civilians. These are the complicating moral notes that complicate any simple narrative of technological determinism. When the tide of a battle shifted, it was often because commanders made a string of decisions, some based on intelligence, some based on misperception, some based on a mechanic's counsel, and some on the courage or caution of individual soldiers. In the stories that bend history, you will often find human acts. A sergeant who kept a convoy moving through a night ambush, an NCO who insisted on one more repair before dawn, a spotter who called a correction that allowed artillery to find its mark. Epilogue: memory, measure, and modest claims. Tell a father, an aunt, or a neighbor that a single bullet can change history and they will smile because they know stories are rarely that simple. But tell them that 1,000 small choices, all made well or all made poorly, can turn a campaign and they will nod, remembering the way a day's delay or a night's rain can alter plans. World War II was vast. It was fought by millions, planned by a few, and lived through by each person who stepped into its long shadow. The simple sniper tactics, the modest weapon fixes, the incremental improvements to tank operations, these were not the only things that turned the tide. Yet they were part of the mosaic. They were the oil on the gears and the patience that bought time. They were the innovations that let soldiers keep moving and commanders make better decisions. If you have memories of that time, this story has been written to honor them, to treat the small acts with the seriousness historians often reserve for battles and treaties. The men and women who served were the ones who transformed machines into strategy and material shortages into solutions. That is the human story behind the steel. Attention to detail, quiet craftsmanship, and a belief sometimes stubborn, sometimes tired, that the next repair, the next observation, the next patient wait might matter. More often than not, it did. He remembered the hedgerow like a living thing. When Tom Carter first crested the slope and caught sight of the bocage that lined the lanes outside Saint-Germain, he felt as if the landscape itself had turned conspirator. The hedges were not mere fences. They were walls, carved by centuries of hands and bound by roots so thick they might as well have been stone. They rose in ragged tiers, an old farmer's private fortress stitched together with earth and wire, with narrow arcing lanes like scars where carts had once passed. In the dawn light they cast long, knife-edged shadows, and every shadow was a question. On paper, the plan had said nothing about answers. Papers never did. They drew neat arrows and blocks, assigned objectives, and measured time against maps that made the hedgerows flat and simple. The men who had to live inside those maps learned quickly that reality measured itself in inches. The first hedge they hit was quiet, too quiet. A single burst of machine gun fire had already told them something they could not read on any map, that an enemy could be small, patient, and almost invisible. Tom crouched behind an overturned cart, clutching a rifle that felt both familiar and suddenly inadequate, and watched Sergeant Lewis move like a shadow along the lane, his breath a low thing in the cold. They were a platoon of 30. The hedge made them into a series of small rooms. Each doorway, each knothole in the bank, potentially hid a man who knew the ground better than the map makers did. "Watch the flanks," Lewis murmured, though there were few flanks to watch that mattered. It was less an order than a prayer. What held Tom's attention, beyond the hard geometry of the hedgerows and the sudden stops of men who had bogged down at a single gap, was the way small choices became enormous in consequence. A young soldier moving too quickly across a lane, an officer deciding to roll forward rather than pull back, a spot of white cloth fluttering where something had been missed. Each might be the spark that lit a firefight. The hedgerow magnified errors. It concentrated resolve. A single shooter, well concealed in the rooted darkness, could slow a whole battalion. Later, years after the war, Tom would try to describe the sensation to people who had never been in a place that had become an obstacle by growing. He found himself using the same words again and again: patience, observation, discipline. Not because those were military slogans, but because they were the simple rules that saved men when steel and numbers became blunt instead of decisive. Across the oceans, where coral shores met jungle green, the rules shifted, but the lessons held. On Tarawa, on Peleliu, on a half-named spit of land the maps of high command treated as a single point, soldiers learned that the environment rewired their instincts. The Pacific Islands were not the same kind of prison as the Bocage. They punished with heat, with claustrophobic humidity and salt that ate at metal like time. Visibility could be 200 yards and the enemy would still be behind you, in a slit dug into a reef, in a tangle of roots half submerged in black, brackish pools. There, a person alone could be a decisive obstacle, not because the ground itself conspired, but because the ground was complicated in ways maps could not show. Martin Alvarez remembered a man they called Old Jonas, who seemed always to emerge from the jungle with a grin and a hand cupped around a cigarette. Jonas was not a warrior the way the sergeants and officers were. He was a scout in the older sense, someone whose life had taught him how to move, how to listen, how to use shade and silence as tools. The platoon's commanders relied on these men. They trusted their eyes and were trusted as a living part of the unit's nervous system, unseen but necessary. Jonas taught them to slow down, not to stand shivering like statues on a trail, but to let the trail raise its eyebrows and reveal what it wanted, to watch for the tremors of life in a fern. He taught them to make the jungle speak without forcing it, to collect its information in scraps the way an insect's path crossed a leaf, the fresh bite on a fruit that meant someone else had passed recently. It didn't matter that these were small signs. When the enemy chose not to give battle but to become part of the land, those small signs were the language of survival. Between hedgerows and jungle, the story of the war folded into pockets of invention. There were sappers who learned to make their bridges outlast plans and supply lines that stretched like groping fingers into the enemy's teeth. There were workshops that smelled of sweat, oil, and coffee, where a mechanic named Eddie would stare down a blown gearbox and make a decision that had nothing to do with a manual and everything to do with the business of continuing. Eddie ran a small workshop behind the lines, a place without proper tools and with too few spare parts. Engines were heavy-mouthed beasts that refused to die quietly. They demanded attention, and Eddie and his men gave it. They improvised bearings from scavenged bronze and turned brackets from scrap. They lined oil pumps with leather from an old boot because the proper seal would not arrive in time. To the clerks filing requisition forms, these were failures of supply. To Eddie, they were challenges with a human face. A lieutenant needed his vehicle to get a wounded man out. A baker needed his truck to keep the ovens warm. What you can't buy, Eddie would say, you make. It was not grand, but it had consequence. One reinforced axle at a crossing meant a supply convoy arrived the next day instead of being stranded for a week. One all-night solder kept a radio alive out of hours. With that radio, a commander learned of an incoming threat and moved his men to safety. The small ingenuity of the workshop extended the life of the machinery, and with that life came choices, to move, to delay, to press an advantage. The work was improvisation by necessity rather than design. The men who did it were not glory-seeking inventors, they were pragmatists. But because they were pragmatists, they tended to practice a kind of quiet creativity that carried weight. In bivouacs and mess tents, stories began to circulate about the man who made a tank run again with nothing but wire and a pair of pliers, or the radio operator who cobbled together a transmitter from ceramics and salvaged wire. The details were often exaggerated in the telling the particular shape of a bracket, the exact number of turns in a coil, but the truth beneath the exaggeration was simple. Human attention and stubbornness could outlast supply chains. Captured material had its own afterlife. When a patrol seized a half-buried vehicle or found an abandoned rifle, the scavenging that followed was not only about weapons, it was about language. Men learned the shapes of enemy gear, the sound of unfamiliar engines, the way foreign ammunition packed into a crate. That knowledge could be economical, sometimes life-saving. A map in another hand, a radio with a different frequency band, a sign painted on a tank, these were pieces of a puzzle. The men who learned to recognize them could use that understanding to their advantage, not to teach others how to kill, but to anticipate, to plan, to navigate a landscape in which the enemy's logic had left traces. At the edge of a field repair shop, Anna watched the men and thought about what was being made of metal and what was being made of people. She had been a nurse behind the lines, and where the sappers made life for soldiers possible by keeping engines moving, she kept minds from unraveling by listening. In the dark hours, when the bandages had been used and the last ration of chocolate was half gone, men would talk. They told her about the places they had seen, the friends they had lost, the things that had made them laugh to keep the fear at bay. Her hands could do little for a burnt engine, but they learned the economy of being present. She patched wounds and, by being there, allowed a man to find his way back from the edge of panic. Stories moved between these nodes, between the hedgerow, the jungle, the workshop, the med tent, and they changed shape as they passed. There was a kind of oral engineering that the war fostered. Technique became tale, and tale became instruction in the broadest sense. You did not teach a man to snipe from a hedge in a classroom. You taught him to be quiet, to resist the urge to make his presence known, to hold his breath until the world made room. But you did not teach the telltale details. The lesson was moral as much as technical. The patient act often outweighed the violent one. There was a particular evening, after 3 days in a hedgerow line, when Tom and Martin crossed paths because of a broken radio. The radio was old and had been damaged by rain. There were no parts that fitted, and the Army had other priorities. Tom's unit needed the set to coordinate movement across a patchwork of lanes and hedgerows. Martin's men were 4 miles off, with a supply truck that would not start without a signal of support. The problem was not how to fix the radio, it was whether someone would take the risk to pass along a message in the open fields between hedgerows and come out the other side. Anna patched up a radio operator's hand and made a pot of coffee that tasted of powdered milk and stubbornness. Eddie stripped what he could from a scrap of an agricultural generator, and they made a fragile arrangement of wire and hope. They did not reconstruct the radio. They built a bridge long enough to let a message cross one gap. Tom and Martin took turns, one watching for movement, one running with a folded paper that contained a single tight set of orders. They moved like a thought, quick and precise, and they almost didn't make it when a burst of fire bit the air too close. The sound was terrifying and ordinary, and they learned what the war taught all of them. Margins are measured in minutes and courage. Later in life, Tom would try to parse what it meant to have taken the risk. He would insist that courage was not the absence of fear, but the translation of fear into attention. When a man is scared, he can become useful if he allows fear to sharpen his senses rather than unmake them. That was the lesson of the hedgerow and the lesson of the jungle and the lesson of the workshop attention, not bravado. Beneath the immediate business of surviving, another thread ran. The day after, the memory of what had been done. In town squares and provincial courts, the survivors argued over maps and medals. In kitchens and back rooms of building sites, men who had mended tanks and radios and bridges brought those habits of making into a peacetime rhythm. The man who had made a brake lining from leather became, after the war, a mechanic who could fix anything in town. The radio operator who had soldered a transmitter from scavenged ceramics opened a small shop that tuned neighbors' radios and became the man who knew how to make a community speak.